Good afternoon. Welcome to the Evangelical Press Association's webinar, a conversation about race, grace, and forgiveness, as we explore effective ways you as writers can promote racial healing to your readers. I'm Lamar Keener, EPA's Executive Director. We are glad you are here for this important discussion. Last week, Patricia Raybon's session asking the question, can we write our way to racial healing, drew a live attendance of 120. And since then, more than 225 have watched the recording on YouTube. Attendees described Patricia's presentation as thoughtful, deeply challenging, clear, and grace-filled. As she ran out of time to respond to your questions, I asked Patricia to return this week to address the questions. And then she suggested we add a few more voices to the discussion. So today we'll have a conversation. Joining Patricia is Joyce Dinkins, Executive Editor and Publishing Leader at Our Daily Bread Ministries. Joyce has decades of experience in Christian journalism. Mark Galli is recently retired after 30 years with Christianity Today, the last 8 of which he was editor-in-chief. The Reverend Esau McCaulley, PhD, is a New Testament scholar at Wheaton College, and he's also the director of the Next Generation Leadership for the Anglican Church in North America. I thank all of you for taking time out of your schedules to engage with us. This session will be recorded and available on YouTube within 24 hours, probably even yet today. You can watch it again or share it with others who would benefit from it. Use the chat button for short comments and reactions. But if you have a question you would like to be considered, that should be posted using the Q&A button. We already have quite a few questions that were submitted last week, and we're going to tackle those first. We'll try to accommodate as many as we can in this hour. Patricia, thank you for joining us again. Do you have any comments before we get started?
Just a quick thank you to everybody. Like you, I'm a bit humbled that we're willing to take on this challenge of helping to shift the atmosphere in our nation and our world, using this humble gift that we have been given. So thanks for those of you who were here last week, and for those of you who are new and returning, and to our panelists. I'm honored to be with you all, and I thank you in advance for the discussion that we're going to have today. Thank you, thank you.
So I'm going to I'll pose a question. One of you want to take the lead on it. I might even address one of you specifically, but any of you can respond to whatever comments you want to add. And just try to keep it succinct, to the point, so we can move through a lot of these. So I'm going to start off with Esau. It's a theological question. What is God's creational intent for the Christian writer? Is it to be a preacher, a prophet, a teacher, exhorter? What is it?
Well, I think I think what you want to do first is kind of put Christian writer within the category of art and culture, because the writer is someone who's participating in creating in some form culture or art. And if you look in the Bible, you see, especially after the fall, you see 2 things happening at the same time. You see, kind of leading up to the flood, you see both the creation of culture, of cities and music, and kind of the increase of sin happening at the same time. And so part of what you see then is that art exists, that the creation of culture exists in the context of the fall. And so all of the art that we create is in some sense tainted and broken by the fact that we're not all that God created us to be. And so then the question is, part of what the artist is attempting to do is to make that brokenness plain and articulate a vision for what comes after it. But that can take as many forms as the Bible itself. So the Bible has historical narrative, where the author is simply telling people what happened and people can infer from that what they ought to do. The Bible has poetry in it, and through which it communicates God's truth. The Bible has laments. The Bible has thanksgivings. The Bible has letters that instruct. The Bible has biographies. And so I don't know if there's one particular task, right, that the writer has to do as a Christian, because I don't know if there's one kind of genre in the Bible that kind of has to be our defining genre. So, but I would say that in all of those ways, all writers are reflecting the culture in which they live, that in either in a way that says this is what's happening, this is its brokenness, or this is what it might be. And so I would say that part of the writer's job is to discern where within that wider project they fit. And I'll say one other thing about like what the writer's kind of role is as it relates to thinking of it from the perspective of the Bible. Part of it is joy. And what I mean to that is, if you read the Bible, part of the writing in the Bible does more than simply communicate the information that is necessary, right? There are these poetic turns of phrases that you see in the Bible that aren't necessary to communicate the theological content, right? So the Bible isn't simply like stripping away all distraction to download theological data. Within the Bible itself, you see the allusion, simile, metaphor that kind of reflects the gifts that God has given to the writer to communicate. And so part of the writer's work then is to artistically articulate God's will through the medium in which he's gifted him or her. And I'll say this as an example, and I talked about Psalm 137 in my most recent article for the New York Times. That article, Psalm 137, is one of the most darkest passages in the Bible, but the rhetoric is profoundly beautiful. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered you, O Zion. That's just like, so part of what I want to say is that the writer has a irrepressible gift with language that God has given him or her that manifests itself across the disciplines. And part of what you're called to be as a writer is to enjoy that process and use that gift that God has given you to do to write. I think every writer has that moment where they go, oh, I love writing that sentence. That sentence gave me the joy of the Lord. And so part of what I would say is deploy your gifts to God's glory in whatever medium he has given you to give. He's given you to articulate.
Wow, thank you. I can see why you're the minister among us here. You've got it there. Anybody else want to add to that?
Just a follow-up question to Esau. What restricts writers from tapping into all of those elements that you just described?
Well, I think that for me personally, I think that I am, as a Christian, bound by the limits of charity, right? And so there are things that I can say that would be true that ultimately aren't helpful. And so I'm not bound by things that may or may not be hard. It's like, have I gone beyond simply telling the truth into a form of bitterness that is no longer helpful? The only way that I can like do this is to talk about how we used to do this growing up, where we would have these, we would call them the dozens, where you tell like jokes back and forth to one another. And there's a way of telling that where it's fine, but then there's like that final twist of the knife, right? And your mom's ugly, right? When you say that part, it's gone beyond comedy into real insult. And so as a writer, I am saying, how can I be as plain as I possibly can without a sinful lack of charity? And so like my boundaries then are, what does love require of me to allow my brothers, because I speak a lot about race and justice. What does love require of me to say so that my brother who might be skeptical to me, if God might soften his heart, that he or she will be able to hear me? And so that doesn't rule out plain speaking, but hopefully it infuses what I write with a theological sense of kind of a charity of disposition.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Patricia, this was a question that you said you would like to respond to. As a person of color, how can I continue a conversation with a white person who knows everything? They've studied racism, they've written a paper, yet their actions don't reflect knowledge, awareness, or sensitivity. How would you respond to that?
With the charity that Esau just described, it's a question that invites us to think about listening, and in a way that allows us to restrain the impulse to want to correct and fix people. and to show them where they're wrong. I think about a woman I served with on a board whose views and politics were miles apart from mine. And, but she said, you know, I'd just like to get to know you better. And over a lot of pancakes and coffee, it became clear that the best way for us to get to do that was to sit on our hands and take time to hear what one another had to say. It's a very different place. It's being in a very different place than meeting people so that you can persuade them of your point of view. And I also remember another person on another board who was from DC, a white man who was pretty sure that he knew everything there was to know about African Americans. And so I found a way to not argue, but to listen. And I have to, I don't know about anybody else, but in times like these, I have to pray my way through to that level of calm and willingness to hear. A couple of weeks ago, I forgot, and I ended up arguing. I went down that rabbit hole of trying to convince someone how wrong they were. And of course, nothing much came out of that conversation. So, and then I told somebody the other day, I also have had teenagers. So I know that there's something rich and good about saying, even though you don't agree, saying, that's interesting, can you tell me more? How did you come to that point of view? You know, all of us want to be heard. And so these kind of confrontations are an opportunity to be still for a minute and hear what the other person has to say. And it may take, you know, it may take 3 or 4 or 5 meetings, but eventually that person probably will come around and say, well, what do you think? I've been talking all the time. What do you think? So
one thing that I learned, well, I shouldn't say I learned it, but it really came to mind just a week or so ago through a discussion, was 2 words that we need to get rid of in our vocabulary that go together are yes, but. When we're hearing somebody and we want to say yes, but, and then we want to come back with our own response to counteract that. Sometimes we just need to listen and say, yes, I hear you.
I hear you. Yeah.
All right.
I always think about, like, I always try to discern is, and I'm very, I don't want to sound like I disagree with Ms. Raybon, but what I try to discern is this person a good faith listener who might just have a different perspective, or are they actively hostile? And what I try not to subject myself to are too many conversations that might lead to bitterness in my soul. And so if there's someone who I feel like just has their talking points, like, you know, lined up, and they're not actually proximate to African Americans, and I'm the one Black person that they know they're going to download all of their arguing with Black people talking points to, that I don't find that helpful. What I find is someone who may even be like, and we don't even always come to an agreement, but if the disagreement is in charity, and we're both trying to discern as best as we can the ways of Christ, there's a different tone that conversation takes. And if that conversation takes, like, and it feels like it's worth my time and energy, then I engage it. And maybe that was what she was saying in a different way, but I often say, you know what? The way that you're coming at me feels like this is, you want to give and take in a fight, and I don't want to fight with you. I do want to talk to you together about the best way we could follow Jesus as it relates to racism or injustice or the absence thereof, but I don't want to just argue with you and, like, you have your talking points and I have my talking points. We just yell at each other on the internet. I don't find that Christ is glorified through that kind of interaction.
Mark, I'm going to turn the attention to you here with this next question. How can I speak out and take a stand without seeming political? Many of my evangelical friends believe Democrats are lost souls and associate racial issues with divergent political parties.
Well, I think one thing that separates political writing, it's like Esau said, it becomes argumentative writing. It becomes I'm trying to convince you of something. And yeah, one thing you're trying to do in writing is to convince someone of something, but it saves you from being perceived as political if you take the trouble to really understand the people or the issues that disagree with your point of view, and enter into those criticisms of what you're about to say sympathetically and say, now many people will say in reading this X, Y, and Z. I happen to think that they have a point. I don't actually agree with them completely, but I think the reasons they make that argument are such and such, and I understand that, and I get that. I just happen to come from a different point of view, and this is what I think. If you can, when you're in the middle of an essay trying to convince someone of someone, and you can raise the best arguments of the opponent of your essay or your ideas, and talk about them charitably, and to try to empathetically understand why someone would take that point of view, then as you continue through the essay, the reader will think, okay, I don't know if I agree, but this person gets me. This person understands me. And it changes the whole tone of the writing and the reading, and moves it along the lines that Patricia's been talking about. But in a writing is a one-way communication, but you can make it kind of a two-way communication if you enter in sympathetically to the views of those who oppose you.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Just to say, let's all put a pin on that, Mark. That speaks to technique that's available to us. And that's one in the essay format that works so profoundly well to acknowledge opposing views, and thereby show your reader that you are aware of them, and that you're willing to concede and to acknowledge that other people hold them. And there are other, as writers, there are just some lovely techniques like that are in our toolbox that we can use intentionally, and they just work well.
Next question I'm going to pose to Joyce. Certain cable news stations broadcast a steady stream of coverage of racial justice personalities and their activities that's often alarmist. How can a writer offer more balance and objectivity?
Wow. I probably watch some of those stations, actually. But kind of stumped on that. I'm not really sure how to answer that. Really not sure how to answer that. I don't mean to disappoint, but read the question again.
I think
certain cable stations broadcast a steady stream of coverage of racial justice personalities and their activities. It's often alarmist. How can you write with more balance and objectivity?
Well, I think that Mark and Esau and Patricia just talked about including, as a writer, others' points of view. And I think that's healthy. But I think I'm stumped by the word alarmist, because I think, for example, in today's news, there's a lot to be alarmed about. And I think the information is important to share, and the points of view important to share. So go ahead, Esau.
Well, there's two definitions of alarmist, and not knowing so it could be the writer is referring to people who portray African-American calls for justice as calls for lawlessness. And so that person could be an alarmist, right? Because they're saying the African-Americans who are talking about, these systemic problems are actually just trying to overthrow the government. So that's one way of saying that this person is alarmist. Or it could be saying that the African-Americans themselves who are calling for justice are the alarmists. And so it's hard to answer that question unless you understand the perspective from which the person is asking it. And I think that it's fair to say and this is one, and let me use this analogy. And can I just speak for a second, 30 seconds? When someone says I'm a conservative or I'm a Republican, they will often then make a qualification. Well, I'm not this kind of Republican. I'm this kind of Republican. I'm like, a Trump Republican, or I'm a Bush Republican, or I'm a Reagan Republican. They kind of say, don't put me in all of these categories, put me in this category. So they're saying there's a wider movement. In this wider movement, I'm not with everything. I'm with these two things, or I'm only Republican because I'm pro-life. And so they can make these distinctions. But when it comes to African-American pursuits for justice, we're often portrayed by the most progressive or radical element of it and say, okay, here's an African-American contending for justice who did something radical. Now the whole movement is thereby discredited. And so African-Americans can only function as a collective when other groups are allowed to make these little nuanced arguments. And so what I would say is there's a variety of people who in the United States, in the African-American context, who are saying there are real problems in society, and that the solutions and the articulations of those problems operate from a variety of worldviews. And so the reason the Christian is speaking about injustice and the reason why someone who's not a Christian is speaking about injustice are going to be different. Mm-hmm. But they still are pointing to the thing itself. And so I don't think it's fair to judge a movement by the elements of the movement that you don't like. I think it's important to judge each person as an individual. And part of the job of the writer is to make those distinctions, right? The writers should be able to articulate the field and then say, well, this is helpful and this is not helpful. They agree here, but they disagree here. And so part of what it means to be a writer then is to speak the truth about what's going on and not simply look for the rhetorical ways to disagree with something that you are already internally hostile towards.
I would add, that's a very good comment, Esau. I would add that what generally happens in alarmist writing is a couple things. It's that notion that, so let's point out to the Democrats. The Democrats are trying to make America secular and trying to cram their secular ethic down our throat. Well, all of a sudden, all Democrats fall into the same pile, which is not true. And the second thing that happens is the Democrats are essentially evil. And what happens in alarmist rhetoric is that one group, not only is there this, I'm a loss for words, but yet making everybody in that group the same. They are essentially evil, and they're not to be reasoned with. And those are two. If you can avoid those two things in your writing in response, you will avoid becoming an alarmist, and you'll be able to respond in a way that's helpful to people.
And I think it's important to remember like at least two key theological ideas. One, and forgive me if I'm sounding too much like a Bible scholar here or a theologian. One is this idea called general revelation, and the other one is called common grace. Both of those are ways of articulating the fact that we all as human beings have some innate knowledge of good and evil, and that even people who are non-Christians are allowed to say things that are true. And so it is very rare that a person is, I mean, you could say Hitler on one side, who's like just utterly evil, but most of us are some mix of good and bad. And so even people who are sometimes profoundly wrong, there'll be elements of what they say that are true. And so part of what I want to say is the Christian, and this is maybe what Mark is getting at, the Christian isn't simply allowed to dismiss valid concerns because some people who articulate those concerns are engaging in behavior that we might disagree with. And so that's what I would say is that, and so part of it is to say, well, then like, even if someone talks about racism in a way that you don't like, even though you're not the arbiter of truth, the question is, why is this person saying this? And is there reality behind that which they articulate? And if that's the case, then you can begin there. I find that a lot of my evangelical brothers and sisters, you can read like I want to put a percentage, a significant percentage of the writings that begin, yes, these concerns are valid. And that's basically the only affirmative statement about African Americans questions. And then the rest of the article is the but. And it's paragraph after paragraph about all of the ways in which we're articulating the problem wrong and what the real solutions are. And it's really simply saying like, and that part of the article goes on so long that the initial affirmation gets lost. And so what I would really ask my brothers and sisters to do is to say, can you actually write whole articles that affirm the things that African Americans are concerned about? Just a whole article, and then just stop the article. Say the end, and see what happens.
You know, another way, thank you for saying that. It speaks to one of the other questions that came in last week, Esau, that said, how can I write about how can I affirm that Black Lives Matter when I disagree with the Black Lives Matter organization? And first I was going to say, well, first it's a movement, which is another essay, which would be a lovely essay on social movements and how they develop. But when we start to, the qualifier, the but, disqualifies whatever you're writing about, which is what you're talking about. So for that person, I was going to suggest an article that just says, this is not about Black Lives Matter. This is about Black lives. And then spend the rest of the article talking about those systems and elements and pressures that are burdening the lives of Black Americans and other marginalized people, so that the writer doesn't even give room to the qualifying statement. It just says from the outset that this is not about this. This is not about Black Lives Matter. This is about Black lives, and then go from there. But the other point I wanted to make, just from a practical standpoint, to speak to what everybody has been talking about on this subtopic, is the tension that resides here for us as writers gives us opportunity to go find somebody who is active in a movement that maybe we don't understand, and sit down with that person and connect, do an interview, do some journalism, and and you know, so that we're not evaluating people at arm's length and not being these keyboard warriors. Just, you know, put some legs on it and go meet some people. And that's the article that I want to read. We've seen all the other ones, but you know, here's a question for you, Mark. Do you think, I know you're retired, but do you think Christianity Today, for example, would do a one-on-one with somebody from Black Lives Matter? You think they'd assign somebody to do that?
That's very possible. Yep, that would be. In fact, you know, as I look back on my career, I can think of many things I wish I'd pulled the trigger on and never quite did. But one of the things I wanted to do was to have essentially a series of interviews with what I'd call, well, friendly or unfriendly outsiders, in which Christianity would interview people, some of whom they agree with but weren't Christians, some who they disagreed with fiercely but wanted to engage with them in civil conversation. I think the current staff there would be open to that, but I can't speak for them, obviously. Really interesting conversation, though. Really interesting, especially with the leaders of Black Lives Matter, the organization. I'd love to read that.
Yes, I would too.
I would add one thing to what Patricia hinted at, something that I tried to do in my writing, and that is, whenever you can avoid a cliche in the current conversation, it's better to use other words to talk about it. So I would try to avoid the word racism or systemic racism or Black Lives Matter, but I would try to talk about those things in language that, so people they see the word racism and all of a sudden their eyes glaze over. But if you describe a racist incident literally like as best as you can, you don't need to say that word, but you've said something more powerful than the word. So whenever you have, sometimes you can't avoid it because of the nature of the conversation, but if you can, it really helps opens people's eyes to the realities without having to then do all this masking of, oh, it's racist, he's a liberal, I don't want to listen to him.
This would be a good thing, because I disagree.
Okay.
I disagree vehemently with that idea, because here's the thing. You can go back. I mean, you can trace this from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King to right now. There's never been a time in the history of the United States where the ways in which African Americans have described racism has been acceptable to the majority culture. And every single time the move has been, let's modify the language into such a way that the people can accept it. One of the things that and this is the Louis Giglio problem, right? And Louis Giglio spoke inarticulately. But what he was trying to do was to say, because white privilege is a block, I'll choose another language. And what this actually is to say, we're going to center the emotion of one group rather than an accurate description of the thing. At a certain point, there's the accurate set of words that have been created by the oppressed people to articulate their oppression. And so the demand that we always articulate our oppression in ways that don't emotionally trigger feels like it is an unreasonable demand. And it ultimately, like, at a certain point, and I've been a pastor, right? At a certain point, you have to say to someone, stop cheating on your wife. Like, there's no nice way of saying it. Stop committing adultery. And that hit of being confronted with one's sin is inevitable. And so, yes, there are like ways that are too inflammatory, right? But there's always an edge to the ways in which sin is articulated. I mean, John says, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? And so, you know what, John? Brood of vipers is a hard word. Why don't you find another way of talking about it? And so I get it, and I try not to be unnecessarily provocative, but certain times, behind the emotional response to Black language is the belief that the problem isn't that bad in the first place.
That'd be a great essay for you to write, Esau. Because Marcus speaks to the truth of how people react. And he also speaks to this confusion that we have about even naming what's happening. I was talking to a friend last week about how people use the word racism and what they're really talking about is prejudice. If one agrees that racism has to do with power and policy, but now we've just co-opted the term in our culture to mean any kind of bias, any kind of racial prejudice or bias. So oftentimes we're talking at each other using these different words when we're talking about different things.
Yeah, I think you saw what I was driving at was more a matter of kind of a classic writer technique. So, for example, one of my favorite passages in literature is by Isaac Bashevis Singer, who's a short story writer, won the Nobel Prize in the 60s. And he has this opening paragraph about this, and he's describing a town called Frample. And if you and I were to write the sentence to describe Frample, we would say it's old, it's dying, and it's poor.
Yeah.
He writes a paragraph in which he describes Frample and never uses those three words.
Yeah.
And when you're done with the paragraph, you absolutely know that town is dying, old, and deeply impoverished. And it's that type of writing. Anyway, that's what I'm trying to get at. I think you can actually say something more powerful and more truthful sometimes when you avoid a specific adjective or adverb to describe it. I think that's kind of a classic understanding of great writing. But I do get your point about you don't want to avoid naming sin. I think my credentials as a person who wrote a Trump editorial in December. I'm not afraid of naming.
I wasn't accusing you. I think it's
but I think there are times. No, I know you weren't accusing me. You were disagreeing with me. I agree with that.
Yeah, I guess this is the tension between, like, as a writer. So I think, and you might be able to find this out, I don't think I've ever, as a writer, just written the word like Black Lives Matter as a slang. It's usually in the context of some other rhetorical move, because just as a writer, it's just like it's a trite phrase, right? Just to put it, I may have to say like my Black Life Matters or something to make it feel like it hits you afresh. And so that's part of to say, as an artistic writer, you don't want to rely upon cliche, so you use creative language. But as a theologian, I want to say that like the church started arguing about homoousios, because they felt this is the best word that we have to articulate like the nature of kind of who God is. And so sometimes we do have to say that like theologically, this term best describes the reality that when I'm writing poetically, I don't articulate. And so I would say something like systemic racism is a very good concise phrase that describes reality. And so I think there's a difference between like whether or not certain words are appropriate and when they're deployed. And I was thinking more along the lines of, as a theologian, there's certain words that I'm going to argue for that are necessary as shorthands to describe something that as a writer, I might use the paragraph that you're talking about to articulate.
Yeah, okay.
All right, let's, that was a lively discussion. Thank you. Let's move on to, here's some questions that came in. How can writers approach the topic of racial injustice without sounding authentic or tone deaf? In other words, how do white writers address racial issues beyond white audiences with authenticity? Who wants to tackle that?
I have a very simple response to that, and it's from Resource for Writers that says you can't write about anything that you've not experienced, that you don't understand, you don't comprehend, you haven't really studied. So I think there's hope if one has whatever their culture is, if they know the topic, you can write it. If they've experienced, even if you're not in my skin, if you have relationships with others who've experienced deep relationships, I think that you can write. And I think also that you can ask for a good editor to help you, to serve you as you write. I wanted to jump back to the earlier comment about being direct. I'll just say it that way, as Esau was saying, being direct things out, and respecting also Mark's comments about anecdotally addressing something and easing into an argument. I think that's all good. I wanted to relate to the conversation, the issue of getting published, because we can write, but then the issue becomes, will we be able to get it published? I think some of the comments that I've seen, the questions that I've seen, have to do with not only how do you give yourself permission to say what needs to be said, but then how do you gain permission to get it spread abroad? And I'd love to hear us interact around the issue of the power structure in publishing that exists, that edits our voices, that actually segregates voices. I think this is a historical issue, and I'm piggybacking that on top of the question from the writer. But we write what we know, what we've experienced, and what we studied. Otherwise, I think unless it's an exploration and it's admitted up front that we don't really know, but we're just sort of giving a stream of consciousness argument to something, we have to honor readers by writing what we know. And if we don't know, we have to find out. And there are ways to find out. I heard Dr. McCaulley recently, as today, in another context, mention, go to a Black church. If you want to experience the African American church, historical Black church, go to the church and begin to understand, establish relationships. So I may be rambling a little bit, but there is that issue of not only how do we write, but as Galli knows, how do we get pieces like he wrote published?
Well, and I think there's another question here that really kind of goes along with that. You, Joyce, as well as Mark, in a sense, you've been editors, you're in charge. The question is, gatekeepers at evangelical publications have prevented me from writing about race topics, calling them controversial. Tide is turning. The question is, how can we get through these gatekeepers? Some gatekeepers label writers who suggest race topics as liberal troublemakers, even if we're orthodox. What's the best way to confront this problem?
Well, I'll give one word. It has worked for me, patience.
Yeah.
Patience. Go ahead, Esau.
I will say, like, the fact that I'm on this webinar to me is shocking. I never thought that I would be a writer telling people how to write. I started writing out of literally the overflow of my heart on my own personal website. And I just started publishing my stuff. And I went back recently. It was horrible. And most of it you can't find online because I've taken it down. But I just wrote a lot of bad articles that nobody read. And over time, I eventually got to the place where there was a medium-sized publication that says, will you write for us? And I said, sure. And a lot of those articles were bad too. And eventually, like, someone suggested me to Christianity Today. And that was maybe 2-3 years into writing, at least something that was published maybe once a month, a couple of times a month for 2 or 3 years. Eventually, from there, I went to Christianity Today. I wrote for them, and I still write for them regularly for a year or two. And then eventually I got noticed by the Washington Post, who asked me to write some stuff. And then eventually the New York Times. And so for me, it was just like, keep telling the truth, keep honing your craft. And when you get the opportunity, and I'll sound like a rapper. Like, if you get a feature on an album, you need to have the best feature on the album. If you get one verse, knock it out of the park. And so your talent becomes so undeniable that because one of the things that's going to happen is they're going to underestimate you until you outperform expectations. And then they're going to retroactively say, we believed in you all along, when they gave you a small chance. So when you get the small chance, destroy it. Like, write the article that God has given you to write. And then tell everybody that you know that loves you to share it everywhere. And once you have that opportunity, bring it over and over and over again. And that's not something that I've been doing this for 5 years, roughly. And just, I am embarrassed by what I was saying in 2015. And hopefully in 2025, I'll be embarrassed by these articles. So keep building, keep working. And the last thing I'll probably say is, it is true that the first time I got into Christianity Today, there was a woman named Tish Harrison Warren, who was already established. She was a white woman, really good friend of mine, who said, this is someone you should listen to. So she copied me on the email to CT and said, publish this guy. And so there is this sense that as writers like me, that doesn't mean all y'all can email me, but as writers like me, it is my opportunity to say, if I see talent, I will reach in and say, here, give this person a chance. And so part of it is like, it's part of the work is to kind of do those things.
Here's a question. Another comment on that?
Yes. Thank you, Esau. You affirm what I choose to believe, and that is a big part of getting published has to do with relationships. Anne Lamott says, writing is paying attention, and God is always moving and opening doors and connecting dots. And I spent a lot of time in the early part of my career not paying attention to the doors he was opening and the dots he was connecting. And looking back on the past 5 or 10 years, I can say almost all of my publishing opportunities have come through relationships that I've established, or a referral, a friend of a friend. And those are really God-honoring moments for us as writers. And I think then allow us to bring something extra sweet and special to the opportunity if we are paying attention to them. So to that person who said, oh, this gatekeeper said no, remember to see who's saying yes and work those lanes and those opportunities. They are out there. Editors, I know there's many listening, editors are always looking for good writing.
Here's an interesting question from a person of color, but they're a brown person. They describe themselves as this brown person. Is it okay for me to write how I've been experiencing similar but different racism so that my white friends, which is my primary audience, can be made more aware?
Yes. Sit down now and write whatever that is. And that's related to the person who was asking about how not to be tone deaf. Truth trumps, oh, I don't want to say that. Truth takes us to what we need to say and what people are starving to hear. And so even if you don't know that much about Black life and Black culture, but you're starving to know more, sit down and write about that hunger and that longing. People are, in this moment that we're in, people are desperate to hear what others are saying about what's going on and how they're being impacted by it. And I don't think it's our place to decide who gets to talk. I had an email the other day from a young lady who's an assistant to an author. And finally, after 3 or 4 emails about something else, she happened to mention that she grew up in Kansas. She never heard anything about racism. And all she heard about our country's history was that it's a godly heritage. And hearing her say that at the end of an email that was about something else just stirred in me a longing to hear whatever else she had to say. And so I think we want to be careful about saying only these people get to talk about this stuff. We all need to be talking about it in whatever ways we can and know how. Wherever we are on the learning curve, we have something that I personally, and maybe that's how I'm wired, I want to know what you know and what you don't know. So
that's what you were saying last week in your presentation, that you write your story.
Right.
Yeah. Forgive me for saying too much. I want to at least give for writers to understand this thing too. There's a difference between writing about your community and writing to your community.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is important sometimes to articulate, the African-American experience to the wider world. But you have to also understand that there are African-Americans, Latino, Asian-American Christians who are trying to make sense of their life as a person of faith who also is Black or whatever. And so we can't spend so much time that we're articulating the problem that we don't give them a theology of hope. And so what I try to do in my writings is to actually write my way back into the community that I'm attempting to serve. And sometimes we can get so caught up as writers as trying to get people to understand that we don't actually minister to the people who are misunderstood. And I want to encourage, and one of the sad realities is, and this is not just in evangelical publishing, it's in publishing broadly, very few of them are owned by ethnic minorities. And because our educational system is mostly in majority white institutions, that we can actually ignore the audience that God has given us. And so what I want to contend to say is, like, you may actually have to, because of your education and your social location, are separated from the community that you attempted to eventually serve. And you have to find intentional ways to literally write your way back into that community, so they continue to see you as one of them and as someone who speaks to them and not just on behalf of them.
Here's a question that's come in today. we got a bunch here. We'll try to get through here in the next 10 minutes. Is the concept of systemic racism understood by some parties to have as a corollary that I as a white person am guilty of racism simply because I was born into a society with white privilege? Was I born racist? Who wants to tackle that? Mark, you're the white person on this panel.
You know, Mark Galli, yes and no. And the yes and no is this. Now I may get pushed back from Esau on this, and I welcome it because I'm on my learning curve as well. But I guess there's a part of me that believes that, I hear people say end racism now, and I honestly don't know what that means, because I think human beings, as Jeremiah puts it, the heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? I think I'm a person who's prejudiced. I have all sorts of prejudices. Some I am aware of and some I'm not aware of. I'm a person who's greedy. I'm a person who's lustful. I'm a person who's covetous, that I covet. For me to come along and say, I'm going to end those things now would be absurd, but I do want to struggle against them, and I do want to learn about them more and more. So at one level, if you're born into a society of privilege, you're going to have prejudices, and some of them are going to be racial prejudices. That's just the way human nature is. And the question is not, are we sinful in these ways, but are we, by God's grace and mercy, trying to become aware of it? And are we depending on Him to help us become more and more Christ-like in that? So that's how I would approach it.
Here's a question.
I think that I'm basically in agreement with Mark. What I would say is, and this is probably the best way of, and maybe Mark said it, but I'll try to say it very clearly. I don't think that anybody would have a problem with saying there's systemic lust in America. That our desire for things, especially the commodification of the female form in advertising, in media, in businesses, all of these things affect every structure of our society. And that it's not simply individual people who lust after one another. It's these inequalities, which is the reason why there's rules around college professors and students dating, because we say, you know what, that's an imbalance in the power structure. And we think that because of the fall, we're all apt to lust. And that's something that we will acknowledge as the reality and say, you know what, the entirety of my life is spent fighting against this propensity to do this thing, even though I have the Holy Spirit. And in some ways, this may impact how we function in society. Racism is the only sin in America that we believe we've overcome or that doesn't exist in systems. So if we say America is materialistic from top to bottom, and that our entire economy is based upon someone getting a car that I don't have, and then you see it, we can see it everywhere. But it's only as it relates to race that the idea that it would exist in structures in society is somehow offensive. And so the question is, are you guilty of a sin by virtue of being white? The answer to that question is no. But is it possible that we participate in structures in society that disadvantage people of color because of the brokenness of the world? Yes. And can I say, in the same way I'm going to spend my life fighting racism, or sexism, whatever it is, even though it's never conquered, its inconquerability does not impede my ability to fight against it. And so what I would say is that, like, me and Mark basically agree, but I think it's because of the emotion attached to the discussion of racism, we're more apt to deny its systemic effect in society. People don't believe in evolution until you say people have evolved out of racism. And then we begin in this we believe in inherited social progress. Only as it relates to racism, but nothing else.
Now, I would go further. I certainly agree that there's structural racism. There's no question about it. But I think there's also structural sexism. And
yes.
Structural greed and structural covetousness. I mean, the whole advertising industry is based on covetousness.
Yes.
So that's why I say it's a both and, a yes and no.
I hate to use inflammatory analogies. I hate to do it, but this is the best way I can say about it. The best you can say that, you know what, a good way to end the pornography industry would be to change the individual hearts of all the people who make pornography. Right. But until that happens, we're going to create laws that makes it difficult to distribute pornography because we think it's harmful to society.
Exactly.
So we can do both of those things. Change the hearts of individual people who create the stuff and create laws. And so, yes, we need to change the hearts of individual races. That's great. But in the meantime, while we're changing hearts, we are trying to articulate or put in place policies that protect the people who are vulnerable.
Amen. Yeah.
Let's talk about a different kind of writing, fiction. Can you speak to the notion that some critics say that white authors should not write through the lens of Black protagonists because white authors couldn't possibly understand or because they don't have the right to speak for Black people?
I'd say in this current climate, you certainly want to be really careful about doing that. But the whole point of fictional writing is for the author to enter the skin of other people. So the landmines on that current topic are pretty powerful. So you'd want to, if you're going to do that, you better nail it. So for example, one of my favorite writers is Alexander McCall Smith, who has written this series called The #1 Detective, Ladies Detective Agency. He does a magnificent job of entering into the mind of the lead character, who's a female. But if it's done poorly, it comes across really badly.
A lot of the publishing houses and authors are now using sensitivity editors. I don't know, Joyce, if you're using any at Our Daily Bread, but you know, that's just one practical help that's available for people, even both for fiction and nonfiction writing.
Well, I guess in some respects I am a sensitivity editor at Our Daily Bread, along with others. I have the privilege of collaborating with, which is, I think, at the heart of everything that we do, is to have neighbors and friends who can collaborate with us and different pairs of eyes looking at content and bringing out critique. But I would agree with Mark, and I would simply say marketing, the word marketing, because, you know, authors market their books. And so in fiction or nonfiction, I think that there are some I agree, in this climate, and even before this climate, those who would challenge, unless it's exquisitely, expertly, knowledgeably created and done, those who would even then resist the marketing of content created by those quote unquote outside of the culture. My heart is that any writer should be able to write what they're knowledgeable about, experienced in, passionate about writing. But from a business, just a business and marketing standpoint, I agree with Mark that I think it's challenging for someone who is predominantly a European American to be, for example, Esau's voice. I think that could be problematic. I'd rather hear Esau's voice or Patricia's
I don't write
voice.
fiction, so I get to opt out of this one. I'm not a fiction writer, so I don't know.
Well, let's wrap this up today. Our hour is about gone. Let's wrap it up with this. What is God saying to us now as writers? How can we gain more courage to honor his will in ways for a time as this?
I answered that, Lamar, as a working writer. I make my living at this desk, and so I pray for ways to learn more about my craft pay attention to my audiences, whatever they may happen to be on any one time. Seek the Lord to pour into me what he's inviting me to say, and then pray for the courage to sit down and write it and say it. I invite everybody on the call to take a minute and think about where in the world of faith they happen to live and happen to reside, and ask the Lord to meet you there. You know, there are on this call, there are writers, editors, published agents, and so wherever you happen to live and work, invite the Lord into that corner and give it your best.
I've thought, I've tried to think of what's going on right now using the analogy of the Reformation. At the Reformation, there was this key theological insight that we're saved by faith, justified by faith, apart from anything that we do. And this fundamental true insight led to kind of, in some sense, the growth of what became Protestantism. But some aspects of the Reformation went in places that we said weren't helpful. And that in the midst of good, there was bad also that came out of the Reformation. And so I think that we're in this place right now. This is what I see as a writer, where we as a church, at least I think, are correct on this. There are profound issues of injustice in society that need to be dealt with. And we are in agreement on that. But there are ways of articulating that are deconstructive to the Christian faith in ways that are helpful. And so my call as a writer during this moment is to say, how can I give as clear a biblical and theological account of what God is doing in this moment to keep the more destructive elements of any renewal movement from winning the day? And so I'm asking God to help me see as clearly as I can the whole thing that is happening, and make the proper distinctions, and have the ability to say yes, yes, and no, no. And so that's at least what I'm trying to do in this moment, because there's a lot. And I think that over time, like the Reformation, it'll coalesce into strands that we'll be able to articulate better. But right now, it just feels like a chaos. But I think clear meanings and lines of interpretation that we can discern and analyze and critique will emerge over the coming days, weeks, months, and years.
I'm trying to encourage and thank you for all the profound thoughts that you all have shared that are encouraging me. But I'm at this point in my journey as a person who loves words and loves people, is trying to give encouragement where it's needed, to writers, to others in the industry, trying to be a part of a community that builds up while telling the truth, the hard truths, but builds up, and trying to use my influence to mentor and give back, because I mentioned the word patience earlier, and it's been a number of decades for me where I've waited to see the opportunities that are, I think, now coming forth. And so I view this as a time of great challenge and difficulty and continued struggle for truth and truth tellers, but I also see the tremendous opportunities opening up, and would encourage those who are listening in to look into some of the events the EPA and other organizations are sponsoring, and the publishers who are wanting to hear a diversity of voices. There are doors opening, windows opening, and there are still some struggles. But I hope to be a prayerful encourager and be a help.
All right. Thank you to everyone for being here today. Today's session has been recorded and a URL link will be emailed to everyone when it's been posted on YouTube. Feel free to share it with others in your network who need to see it. For our guests today who are not EPA members, we invite you to take a look at the Evangelical Press Association. We're an association of Christian print and digital publications who believe we are stronger when we support and network with one another. If you're part of a Christian periodical, EPA is for you. If you're an independent writer serving the Christian periodical market, consider an associate membership and become part of our vibrant freelance community. And you can learn more about all this at evangelicalpress.com. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to whatever comes our way in the future that we can share with you. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, Lamar.